Rabbit, rabbit, rabbit. I almost said turtle, turtle, turtle as an April Fool's joke, but I'll spare you. Time for highlights from the Old Farmer's Almanac and the story of the month. So, here we go. Of course, on today, April 1st, Passover begins at sundown. It is also April Fool's Day and a full pink moon. That means that the 3rd is Good Friday and the 5th is Easter Sunday. On the 14th, it is National Gardening Day, but it is also teacher Annie Sullivan's birthday. She was born in 1866, and of course, she was the famous teacher of Helen Keller. And on the 24th of April, the Old Farmer's Almanac founder Robert B. Thomas was born in 1766. In tribute to Annie Sullivan, I have selected my own story about Helen Keller for our story of the month. I don't know if I will ever write an autobiography. You know how you dream big? Because I live in a historic city, I dream that someday people will tour my home and they'll say, this was Storyteller Tim Lowry's books and these were Tim Lowry's furnishings. But I think maybe someday somebody will write my biography. I don't know. I can tell you what will be in the flyleaf of that book. You know how they always have those pithy little quotes? Mine will say, I cannot tell stories on Zoom. And then underneath that in smaller print, it will say, translation, I will not tell stories on Zoom. And then the rest of the page will be filled with, ha, 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 famous last words. A number of years ago, I was invited to the Front Porch Storytelling Festival in Florence, Alabama. And I had the opportunity to take my entire family with me. And for some odd reason, I had a whole Saturday at a storytelling festival free. No responsibility whatsoever. I had done a bunch of school programming during the week, and so I guess they decided that they should give me the Saturday off. And so I had a whole day to play tourist in Florence, Alabama with my wife and my 2 girls. And at the time, my girls were rather small. But I thought, this is a marvelous educational opportunity. So we got dressed in, like nicest tourist clothes, not just old raggedy stuff that you waller around in the car. And we went down to the visitor center right after we had breakfast at the hotel, and we walked in so that we could see the lay of the land, find out what we might do that would be educational for the kids and fun for the whole family. And there were 3 volunteers working at the information desk in the Florence, Alabama Visitor Center. The first one was obviously a college kid. She was dressed in her cheerleading uniform. She had a ponytail sticking out either side of her head, and I am not lying to you. Every sentence started with a bounce and okay. Next to her, it was obvious that she was there probably getting community service points for her cheerleading organization or her college sorority. Next to her was a man that was well past 50 years of age, and he had on a t-shirt that said, don't drink and drive. You might hit a bump and spill your drink. And I was under the distinct impression that he was there for community service for an entirely different reason. Might have been under court order. And then there was a lady standing next to him who had silver hair and everything else on her person was purple. Purple earrings, purple glasses, purple fingernails, purple jacket, purple pants, purple shoes. They were open-toed. Her toenails were purple. So I thought, well, which one do we begin with? The volunteer behind door number 1, door number 2, or door number 3? So we went up to the cheerleader, and I introduced myself and introduced my family, and I said, we wondered what we could do as a family today in Florence, Alabama. And she said, okay, ready? Here's what we're going to do. She said, I would suggest that because I see your kids are little and they probably would like to run around and things, she said, I would suggest that you go over to the old railroad train trestle on the Tennessee River. She said, we have a beautiful view on the Tennessee River. Years ago, there were steamships that went up and down the Tennessee River. Think Mark Twain, only Tennessee. And it was just marvelous. And now that's all gone. That was yesteryear. But we have a railroad trestle that is no longer used for trains, and it goes out to an island in the middle of the Tennessee River. And we've made it into a pedestrian bridge. Okay, so you can get out there and you can walk on that pedestrian bridge. And you can go out there to that island and imagine all those steamships going up and down. She was doing a pretty good job at selling this. And I said, now, my children are young, and I'm not sure they really understand about Mark Twain and steamships and all that. So when we get out there to the island, is there anything else to do? And she said, not really, but it's not as boring as you might think, because it's tradition when you get out there on the island to take your underwear off and throw it into a tree. And I said, look at my children. They're 8 and 6. I have trouble keeping clothes on the 6-year-old as it is. I am not taking them to see an underwear tree. So thinking that I was probably going from frying pan to fire, I moved to the man standing in the middle. And I said, you just heard our conversation. What would you suggest? And he said, Rattlesnake Saloon. How did I know? And I said, what is that? And he said, I'm not going to tell you to spoil the surprise. Here's a map. I thought, well, why not? At least it'll be an adventure. So we got this map, and we went outside the town, way out in the country, and finally we found just this hand-printed sign that said Rattlesnake Saloon and an arrow pointing down a gravel road. So we drove down this gravel road. There was a clearing, and then there was a little building in the middle of this gravel parking lot. I don't know if they ever had these in Utah. Back where I'm from, they would build these little shacks that looked like an outhouse, only there was no hole in it. And they would put them at the children's school bus stop so you could stand in there out of the weather if it was raining or snowing while you waited on the school bus. Did they have school bus shacks here in Utah when you were a kid? And it was like one of those things. And so we park and we go and stand in the school bus shack because I didn't know what else to do. And there's no sign, there's no person, there's no nothing. Just a school bus shack in the middle of a parking lot. And I told my family, I said, we're going to give this 15 minutes. And if nothing happens, we're going to go back to Florence. At 14 and a half minutes, a tractor pulling a hay wagon pulls in, and the guy says, you here for Rattlesnake Saloon? I said, I think so. You tell me. He said, get on. So we get on this hay wagon, and we go down the other end of the parking lot, through this wooded path, and we come out in a larger clearing. There's a great big field of corn, and then there are several corn cribs, which are corrugated round buildings with a peaked roof on the top, and then there's a small wooden structure, and he says, go in there. So we get off the hay wagon, and we go into this wooden structure, and a lady steps up to a counter, and she says, hey, y'all want to rent a room? And I said, no, we're staying at the Hampton Inn back in Florence, and the visitor center recommended that I bring the kids out to Rattlesnake Saloon. And she said, oh, sure, yeah, I just thought you wanted to rent a room. We rent corn cribs where you can spend the night. And I'm like, I'm not spending the night in a corn crib. I've been in corn cribs. I grew up on a farm. There are black snakes in corn cribs and rats and stuff. I'm not staying. I said, I think we would like to see Rattlesnake Saloon. She said, oh, yeah, that's fine. Just walk down the road, round the ridge, and you'll see it. You can't miss it. So we go down this gravel road and around the ridge, and all of a sudden, there's this huge cliff that opens up in the side of the hill. It's every bit as big as this entire tent and higher. And inside that cliff, underneath that rock, they have placed all kinds of patio tables and lawn furniture. And at the back of the cliff, they've built kind of a wooden wall with the traditional flap, flap, flap saloon doors. And so we go back there and go through the flapping doors. And there's 4 girls in T-shirts and Daisy Dukes all leaned over a bar playing Monopoly. And they turn around and they look at us and go, they're too young to drink, but the snake's over there. We were the only people in there. And so we wandered around till we found the rattlesnake at the saloon. He had been there since 1957. And some taxidermist had fixed him up and put him under plexiglass, and they had not dusted him since. So we took a picture with our cell phone, and that was like the whole thing. So we walked back to the car and got in the car and drove back to the visitor center. I am nothing if I'm not intrepid. So we bypassed the cheerleader. We bypassed the man who was there for community service. And we went to the lady who was all in purple. And I said, "We're back. What would you suggest that I do with my family?" And she said, "What you need to do is you need to go to the University of Florence, Alabama, and see our lion. We are the lions. We are the purple lions. That's why I'm all in purple, because I'm a big fan. I'm a member of the Booster Club, and you need to see our lion. You just go straight down Main Street. You'll come to big iron gates. They will be open. Campus is always open. That's University of Florence, Alabama. You go right in there, and just to the right of the fountain, we have a live lion. Actually, we have 2 lions. We are a certified zoo for 2 lions because they are our mascots." And I said, "You're kidding me." She said, "No, absolutely not. I'm absolutely serious." So we walked down Main Street, and about halfway down Main Street, you can hear roaring. And we get through the iron gates, and we turn right at the fountain, and there's this huge habitat, all beautifully done. Truly a certified zoo habitat for a male and female lion. The female lion was laying up on a big rock. There was a fountain feature and all kinds of things, toys and things for the lions to play with. And the male lion, there were double bars. There was a set of black iron bars and then a sidewalk and then another set of black iron bars so that you could not get anywhere near the lion. But the bars were far enough apart that you could, if you got closer, you have unobstructed views. And he's laying up against that inside set of bars, sound asleep, his mane sticking through the bars. And next to him, in the sidewalk between the 2 sets of bars, is a woman sitting in a folding lawn chair reading a romance novel. So we walk up and I said, "Excuse me, because you're on the inside of the first set of bars, I'm assuming that you are the lion's keeper?" And she put her book down. She said, "Oh yeah, that's right, honey. I raised both of these lions on baby bottles. They stayed in a cardboard box in front of my refrigerator at my house where the motor would keep them warm. I was a fan of the refrigerator when they were little babies." She said, "We ordered them from a breeder and we were supposed to get a male because we wanted a male for a mascot and they sent us a female by mistake. And so then we got the male and they're actually not a mating pair. They're brother and sister. So they're fixed. I know this is Alabama, but we got everything taken care of." Yeah. That's nice to know. Thank you. She said, "Now, if you want a really exciting, dramatic picture of a male lion, get your phone ready." And she showed me how to put it up between the bars so there would be no bar in the picture. She said, "Now get ready. This is going to be pretty quick." And she walked over to that big sleeping lion and stuck her finger in her mouth and shoved it down the ear of that sleeping lion. And he didn't do a thing. He just rolled over and went and yawned really big. And I have a fabulous photograph of this lion with his mouth gaping open and those huge fangs. It looks like something from the circus or Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. And that was pretty much it. So we start back to the visitor center and my kids start begging. They're like, "Daddy, please don't make us go back down there. Please don't make us see anything. We want to go back to the hotel and go swimming." I said, "You can go swimming at home. We're going to do it. Please, Daddy, please." Now, my younger daughter is very vocal. So much so, she's like her daddy. She has never had an unexpressed thought. My older daughter is very quiet. But when she speaks, she has summed up lots of stuff. And it's very, very worth listening to. And all of a sudden she stopped and threw out a hip and said, "Daddy, we want to go to the pool. We have to wash the weird off." And I could not argue with that. And I said, "Fine, fine." And my wife said, "You go find something to do. I will take them to play at the pool." So my wife took the kids to play at the pool. And I went back to the visitor center. And I had planned to register a complaint, but the entire staff was gone. They were volunteers in the morning, but in the afternoon, the director of the visitor center covered the desk, and she was wearing a ladies' seersucker suit, y'all. My people. And I went up to her and I said, "This morning we tried to find something to do, educational and fun with my family, and spoke to 3 volunteers." And she just went, "I apologize." And I said, what would you recommend? And she said, I would highly recommend that you drive across the Tennessee River. I said, past the underwear tree. She said, unfortunately, yes. She said, to the neighboring hamlet of Tuscumbia. I said, I like this already. I'm going to travel to the neighboring hamlet of Tuscumbia, Alabama. I said, what will I find in Tuscumbia? And she said, you will find a small estate called Ivy Green. But that didn't mean anything to me. And she said, it is the childhood home of world-famous Helen Keller. And I said, oh, I did school reports on her when I was a boy. I remember my family gathering around the television and watching Melissa Gilbert and Patty Duke play Helen Keller and Annie Sullivan on television in The Miracle Worker. She said, of course you did. I think you would highly enjoy a visit to Ivy Green. So by myself, I got in the car and I went over to the Helen Keller home. I had read Helen Keller's autobiography. And so I knew the layout of that entire house. She did such a good job at describing that home. It's the only place in the world where I've never been and I knew where everything was. I walked through the front door and the docent greeted me and I said, may I see if I know where everything is? She said, certainly. And I said, when you come through the front door, immediately to the right, there is a door at the foot of the stairs. That's Helen's parents' bedroom. She said, that's exactly right. She said, the original furniture is in that room, and Helen's mother's wedding dress is laid out on the bed for you to view. And so I went and looked at that, and then I said, and upstairs is Helen's bedroom. She said, that is correct. She said, Helen's room is on the right, and then there's a little breezeway, and she said, on the left is her teacher Annie Sullivan's bedroom. And she said, now, what you might want to know about that is one day, Helen did not want to do her lessons with Annie Sullivan, and she stole the skeleton key and locked Annie Sullivan in her bedroom upstairs, and Helen's father had to get a ladder and climb up the outside of the house and help Annie Sullivan out the window so she could come down to supper because they couldn't find the skeleton key that Helen had stolen. So I went upstairs, and I saw Helen's room, and I saw Annie Sullivan's room. I came back downstairs, and I said, here is the front room. There's a horsehair sofa. She said, that's exactly right. And then she said, now, Helen in her autobiography did not talk about her key stealing stunts, but this was what she had figured out to entertain herself as a blind and deaf child at 3 years of age. That underneath the stairs in the hallway, there was a broom closet. And she said she figured out one day that her mother was in the broom closet. She said this was before Annie Sullivan came to teach her. And she shoved her mother back into that closet and slammed the door and took the skeleton key and went out and sat on the front porch and locked her mother in the closet. And one of the gardeners saw little Helen sitting on the front porch of the house, clutching a key and laughing to herself, and realized something's up. And he went in and was able to pull the key out of her little hands and let her mother out of the broom closet. And then just beyond the stairs was the dining room. And I said, I remember this scene from The Miracle Worker. This is where Annie Sullivan wrestled Helen Keller into a chair and made her fold her napkin. And at the end of that lesson on elocution and how to act as a civilized human being, she came out and said to her daddy, she has broken several dishes and bent 3 forks, and I have a cut on my left arm, but she folded her napkin. She said, that's right. And of course, her parents felt sorry for Helen because she suffered blindness and deafness, and so they had spoiled her a little bit. And Annie Sullivan wanted to take her away from her parents so that she could work with her alone, but her mother could not bear to have Helen out of her sight. So they set up in the garden house, which was just across the patio from the main house. You could literally toss a pebble from one place to the other. But to set them up there, they put Helen in a wagon and drove her all around Tuscumbia all afternoon for hours, and then came back to her own home and set her and her teacher up in the guest house, and she was convinced that they had driven miles and miles from home. And so she was no longer trying to play her parents against her teacher because she didn't know her parents watched her lessons every day from their bedroom window. When you go out the back door to visit the guest house, right there in the middle of the brick patio is the water pump. And I said, she said, yes, that is the pump where when the light finally dawned on Helen's mind and she understood the signs that Annie Sullivan was making in her hand could be connected with words, and she could utter those words. She pumped water over her hand and said vocally, "Water." And she began to learn to speak. And she said, as a house docent, it is so much fun to stand in this courtyard and watch people come out the back door of the house and go, she said, because it's a moment you never forget when you see it dramatically portrayed. I jumped back in the car and I went to the hotel and I yanked my kids out of the swimming pool. And I dried them off and we got their hair all done up. And I said, come on, y'all are going to learn something. And we went back over to Tuscumbia and I gave my children a tour of the Helen Keller home. My little girls had never even heard of Helen Keller. So I quickly, in bullet points, told them her story on the way over to the historic house. They were most intrigued with two things. One was, outside the guest house, there was a circular hedge with no entranceway. And the docent explained to my girls that that was Helen's hedge of protection. Her daddy had built that for her so she could have an outdoor playground. And he would pick her up as a little child and lift her into that hedge, and she could play, but the hedge kept her from wandering away and getting into trouble. And the other thing that my girls loved was, out in front of the house, there was a great big magnolia tree. And I had read about this, and the house docent explained, she said, we don't know if this is the tree, but we like to think that it is. One day, after Helen had begun to learn, Annie Sullivan realized she had to teach Helen everything because Helen lacked so many common experiences. Helen had never climbed a tree. And so she took her out, and the lesson was how to climb a tree. And Annie and Helen climbed the magnolia tree together. And after they got way up in the tree, she signed into Helen's hand, "It's a beautiful day. Why don't we have our lunch in the tree? We'll have a picnic. You stay here, and I'll go back to the house and pack a basket." And Helen agreed. So Annie Sullivan climbed down, went back to the house, and while she was gone, a thunderstorm blew up. And Helen Keller, at just a few years of age, 9, 10, rode out a violent thunderstorm up in a magnolia tree. And in her autobiography, she said, it was a thrilling sensory experience. And I recommend that everyone ride out a violent thunderstorm in a tree at least once before you die. Well, we had a marvelous afternoon, and it became a favorite family memory. The very next year, I was invited to come back to the Storytelling Festival. And I thought of something. I went to the director. I called her on the phone, and I said, her name is Debbie, and I said, Debbie, I had a thought. I have a good friend who teaches deaf children in Charleston, South Carolina. He has about a dozen kids of varying ages, and he and I are really dear friends. And I just wondered if we could somehow arrange, like on some kind of smartphones or something, could I give a tour on the smartphone and we send it live to his classroom, and he could plug his smartphone into the big board on the big screen, and we could give a live tour from Florence, Alabama of the Helen Keller home to deaf children. And she said, I think so. Call him and ask him what he thinks. So I called my friend Dean, and he said, oh, Tim. He said, you have no idea how thrilled my children would be. He said, you have no idea. He said, in the deaf community, Helen Keller is like a patron saint. He said, my kids would so love that. Let's do it. I said, do you think we can pull it off? He said, sure we can. He said, it's really easy. You have a smartphone. I have a smartphone. That's all we need. I'll take care of the rest. So we set up. I called the director back, and I said, could I get a little time off from the festival to do that? She said, oh, no, we're not going to give you time off. She said, you are completely excused from a full afternoon of activities. We are going to pay you to do this. She said, and I'm going to call the Today Show. We're going to be on national television. This is the best thing I have ever seen. She didn't get the Today Show, but she did get 2 different local news agencies to bring television cameras. So on that day, I'm using my cell phone to give a tour of the Helen Keller home, and there are 2 professional TV cameras following me around, giving news stories about what we're up to. And I would talk to my phone, and Dean would watch on the other end. All of his kids are watching on the big screen in their classroom, and he translates everything that I'm telling them, and he signs it. They would ask questions. If I didn't know the answer, there was a house docent there who could answer for them, and we're exchanging information, and we're just having the best time. And then We go outside to the water pump, and we could see the kids on my cell phone, and they all just went like rigid, sat straight up, as if the President of the United States had entered their classroom. And we explained that this is where Helen learned to say water. We were talking to them on the cell phone, and there's this older couple standing off to the edge watching us talk to a phone. And so I stepped off camera, and I explained to them what we were doing. And I said, I just kind of had an idea, and I wondered if you would play along with us. Would you be willing, I know that you're total strangers, and you might not be comfortable being on camera, but would you be willing to step into the shot and stand at the water pump and let the children in Charleston, South Carolina, teach you how to sign water, how to teach you a word from their language, teach hearing people how to say water at Helen Keller's pump? They said, we would love to do that. So they stepped on camera, and when I told Dean what we wanted to do, and Dean signed to the children what we were going to do, all of a sudden, they rushed the camera. All we could see were fingers flying in front of his cell phone. They were so excited, and he had to pull them away. So they started to teach water. You put a W for water at your lips. Water like that. The older couple, they were signing water back. We were learning to talk with our fingers and hear with our eyes. I might have cried. And the docent certainly cried. And she said, Helen lived a long life. And she said, there are people in this town who remember her. And she said, I never had the privilege of meeting Helen. She said, but I can tell you without a doubt, she would have loved this. That was several years before Friday the 13th of March 2020. When I came home from a school program and the entire world shut down, and I tearfully said to my wife, I cannot tell stories on Zoom. And she said, you already have. You and Helen Keller. And she said, let me remind you of that big magnolia tree. My name is Tim Lowry. I tell stories on Zoom and highly recommend it.